After lunch, Rachel's aunt brought out a box of photo albums that Rachel's mother had stored in the spare room. They all sat around the table, pointing to snaps of people and places, some recognisable to Rachel and her cousins, others that were before their time. "Look, there's that one of Uncle Jim when we went camping that time. Remember that fish that he caught? There's Deborah as a baby, about a month old, I think. And look, there's a photo of you, Rachel, on the day they brought you home." Rachel stared at the small coloured print in the album. She was about 6 months old and looked to be dressed like an old-fashioned doll. Although only young in the photo, her eyes stared intently at the camera while the snap was taken. Her parents had told her from a young age that she was adopted, but she'd never actually seen that picture before. She was probably a little surprised at just how grown-up she was before coming to live with her parents. There were many other photos of her at various ages after that, but no more of them, it seemed, had her attention focused on the camera. In each shot, she would be regarding something or someone else further outside the frame of the photograph, or she would simply be staring upwards, whilst others in the shot would be looking towards a common point. It was always so hard to get her to concentrate, commented to her mother. We were never really sure if in her little mind she was really with us or not. Rachel blushed and shrugged away from further teasing by her cousins. That probably came from living in the home while she was so young, said her aunt. They couldn't possibly show that many children love and attention all at once. That's probably how she learnt to amuse herself, going off in a little world of her own. Rachel felt embarrassed for being analysed and discussed by her mother and her aunt, as if she wasn't even there. She was starting to look for a reason to escape again with her cousins. "Have you ever thought about trying to contact your real parents?" her aunt asked her mother. "Maybe that would help her not to be so withdrawn. It's very common for adopted people to find their natural parents these days. They say it helps with the—" "They don't know who her parents were." The mother cut in on her aunt's concerned rambling. Rachel stopped and looked at her mother. They found her abandoned, without so much as a note to say who she was or even her name. Rachel had never heard this fact from her parents before. She knew she had been adopted from the orphanage when she was still only very young. The home had been unable to disclose any family details, but as far as she knew, this was only to protect the birth mother's privacy. Now she felt strangely unsure and uncomfortable. It was sort of like the feeling you get when you're really enjoying a sandwich and you suddenly find a hair in it. No matter how good the sandwich tasted before, the meal is now tainted and you feel unsatisfied. "Where did they find me?" she asked her mother. "I'm not sure," came her reply. There was something about the tone of her voice that gave Rachel a feeling that her mother wasn't being quite straight with her. "But they'd have to have records at the home," she quizzed her mother again. "We weren't concerned with that, darling. We just wanted to give you a loving home. Now, let's get that cup of coffee going." Her mother left the table and her aunt packed up the photo albums, taking them back to the spare room. The matter seemed to be closed, whether Rachel's curiosity had been stirred or not. She spent the rest of the day hanging with her cousins, and after a few enjoyable hours, the matter had slipped from her mind. With the last of the bags packed and into the station wagon, it was time for Rachel and her parents to farewell her aunt and cousin. They had a long trip ahead and needed to get on the road early, as her cousins had to attend high school the following day. Rachel was sorry to see them go, as they'd been a very pleasant distraction from her thoughts. Her mum and dad had a function to attend. After much reassurance from Rachel, and on the proviso that she did homework, she was allowed to stay home alone for the day. Once they were gone, she did actually open her books, but she found her thoughts kept wandering back to the photo album and the conversation from the day before. She turned the knob on the door and pushed her way into their spare room. A quick glance around located the box of albums sitting in the corner. She switched on the light in the room and lifted the box onto the bed. She pulled the crimson-coloured album that contained her baby photos out of the box and laid open the bedspread before her. She wanted to see the photo from the day before, which saw her looking straight at the camera. The eyes had intrigued her. She flipped through the album's heavy plastic-clad pages until, there again, she saw the baby girl in the little floral dress, the eyes wide open, not squinting against the flash. They were intense and coloured a vivid shade of blue, like the ocean. Gazing out at the world, seeing everything and everyone. The heart-wrenching wails of an infant in distress rang out through the large, dome-shaped ceiling of the room. The baby kicked and flailed helplessly inside the thin cotton wrap in which she was covered. She couldn't have been any more than a few hours old by the look of her, but she was clean and the golden curls on her head shone softly in the candlelight. Her cries had woken the old priest in his bed at the presbytery next to the chapel. He was still tying the cords on his brown tartan robe as he entered the side door of the chapel and flicked on the lights. "What the? Sweet Jesus, have mercy!" he exclaimed. He ran up to the altar and found the tiny, screaming bundle that had been placed atop a huge stone slab. Instinctively gathered up the child into his arms and began rocking and hushing her. in an effort to comfort both the baby and himself. Who could do such a thing? What sort of sick, perverted stunt was it to leave such a vulnerable, helpless creature as a newborn, naked and wrapped in nothing more than a thin white sheet? The evening was cool, and the large stone slab on the altar felt like ice. He quickly passed his eye over the chapel pews, but he really doubted that the child's mother could be anywhere close by. He couldn't imagine that the child's desperate wails would not have been enough to give the mother second thoughts on leaving her, as the baby's forlorn cries had pierced even his own heart with pity. He wrapped the ends of his robe around the infant and pressed her close to his chest, trying to shield her from the cold night air as he crossed the pathway back to the presbytery to find the police and the paramedics. They arrived shortly after. A female officer and a social worker gently prized the now sleeping baby off the old priest's chest and wrapped her in a fleecy warm snuggle rug. They put a small woolen hat on her head, which was still a little bit too big for her, and then attended to her nappy. Luckily, the little girl, even in her distress, had not messed herself. The fine white cotton cloth they removed from her as they dressed her was dry and clean. Her navel, although still moist as with most newborns, was tied with another piece of cloth, similar to the sheet, unlike the plastic clamps that the hospital now used. This led the police to suspect that she had been at home birth, maybe a teenage mother who couldn't face the responsibility of a child, or the unfortunate result of a drug-addicted mother who couldn't care for herself properly, let alone a baby. The priests asked the policewoman what would become of the child now. Every effort would be made to find the child's mother, as she would probably most likely be in need of medical attention herself. In the meantime, the baby would be checked over at the hospital and then placed into foster care until a relative could be located. The old priest took one last look at the tiny baby girl before she was taken away by the authorities. He rubbed her soft pink cheek with his gnarled old finger. The baby instinctively turned her head towards him, making sucking motions with her mouth. "She's hungry," said the social worker. "I'll try her with this bottle on the way to the hospital." He farewelled them all, and they assured him they would let him know as soon as the mother was located. He thanked the officers and followed them outside into the cold night air. He pulled his robe in tightly, trying to strain an extra ounce of warmth out of it as the vehicles drove away. "God bless that poor child," he said, shaking his head. She hadn't had a very pleasant introduction to the world. He passed his eye once more over the chapel grounds and then to the chapel itself. He followed the formwork of its white, painted finish up to the large simple cross at its peak. The moonlight was gleaming on its stainless steel exterior, but something further up was catching his eye. There were colours, twinkling and strobing into each other, high up in the sky. Every now and then, the colours would combine into a flash of white light, just like sheet lightning. He recognised it as the aurora borealis, or northern lights. Funny, he didn't even think it was visible from this part of the world. Eventually the cold got the better of him. He rubbed his arthritic hands together as he headed back inside. He placed his robe back on the hook in the corner of his room and slid his slippers off. Easing himself back into his now ice-cold bed that he had woken from hours before. Very soon he was asleep again, and his snoring kept the silence of the night at bay. That night he dreamt he was standing on top of a mountain during a large storm. He watched in fear as the sky was torn open and the stars gave way to the swirling colours of the northern lights. There was a noise, familiar but distant, repeating itself over and over. "The phone!" cried Rachel as she leapt to her feet and slammed the photo album shut. She threw the box back in the corner and yanked the door of the spare room shut behind her, running down the hallway to the telephone. It was Tamara. Rachel was for once glad for the light-hearted nonsense of their conversation. Her latest vision seemed to have provided her with more questions than answers. Just whom she could ask these questions of, though, Rachel was unsure, so she was happy to lose herself in Tamara's distraction rather than to torment herself with any further soul-searching.